You made it to week 6. Hallelujah. So this week we will talk a lot about risk diversification and risk mitigation. So we look very deeply into the various financial elements, and we look at what kind of collateral they want, what kind of collateral they need, what the risk is that is associated to the finance elements, not only for the investor or for the financier, but also for you as the producer, or if you are a financier, then the financier. But it is important that no matter if you are a producer or a financier, that you understand what the risks are, you can define them, and how you work around them, how you can avoid them, how you can mitigate them, how you can eliminate them. There are different ways of working with that. So we'll be talking a lot about the details and specifications of distribution financing, bank financing, mezzanine equity, free money, co-production, in-kind services, deferments, crowdfunding, and we're talking about the producer investor due diligence checklist when putting together a business plan.
We have established before that any finance plan is only as good as the risk mitigation that is applied. So the idea here is to look at all the various finance sources as well as distribution financing options and focus on risk mitigation and risk elimination, because the more you focus on risks, the more profits you're going to achieve. One element that is essential for you to focus on in regards to receiving profits and higher profits is to implement free money funding sources. We're going to go into free money funding sources in a later chapter, but for now, let me just summarize them as any kind of funding that you do not have to recoup. That is what is referred to as free money options or soft money options. They include, for example, the US tax credits, obviously branding integration. We have some in-kind service options that are free money components. We do have international co-production free money options, grants, international co-production treaty, financing options, and so forth. We will go into the free money options at a later chapter. Just know in general, these are funding sources you do not have to recoup. When we talk about low financing sources or low cost financing options, we're talking about funding that does not require a high interest fee and or a high premium and or a high back-end component or ownership component. When you look at the verified funding sources that we have, that include senior lending, mezzanine, investors, equities, etc., you will notice that every kind of funding source has its cost associated to it. So when you do a senior loan, which is in essence a gap loan by a bank, or it could also be a senior loan provided by a bank-like lender, there are investment companies out there that will take the position of a bank and lend like a bank. You look at them and you establish the cost by having them offer term sheets to you, and those term sheets would include things like interest fees, closing fees, legal fees. They would include other costs that are related to the senior loan option. Senior loans usually require an advance of the interest fees for the entire period, for the entire term, which could be anywhere from 1 to 3 years. Most senior loans for film and television are around 1 to 2 years. When you are looking at these costs, you have to remember that most of those, in most cases, are paid up front. So when a term sheet is issued to you for a loan, you have to think about a number that has to deduct all these costs and fees, and the net number is really what you have available at closing of financing, what you have available when you are funding your production. That's why looking at all the costs related to your financing is very important, because they are going to be deducted in most cases, and you will have only the net amount available for you when you start shooting. Another consideration, obviously, which we talked about before, is restricting your production expenses. Going through your budget line item by line item and really making sure that every line item is valid and every line item is as quoted is extremely important. It really starts with the script by you looking at it very carefully and eliminating every scene that does not carry you forward, that does not offer any kind of message that's important to carry the story forward. So any scene you read in your script that has no relevance, doesn't move the character forward, doesn't move the story forward, you need to cut, because every scene, when you shoot it, costs money. You do not want them to later end up on the editing floor because you paid for it already. Another thing you look at when you restrict your budget is any kind of expenses that do not make it on the screen, because those you really have to watch and eliminate. Marketing cost, any kind of contingencies that are required by the bond company, we'll try to keep those as low as possible. Bond fees, insurance cost, any kind of finance fees, legal fees, publicity cost, and of course your above the line, meaning your producer's fees, your writer, director, talent fees. All of those are very important to negotiate in a way that allows you to minimize your production expense. Always think about certain fees to be deferred. There are actors and there are producers and writers, directors who will agree to defer a portion of their fee and in exchange maybe get a higher back-end participation, a higher profit participation. Those conversations can be had, and it's usually a good idea to ask for deferments because it will reduce your production expense and it's going to make the funding of your project potentially easier. When we talk about restriction of distribution expenses, we're really talking about not just a sales agency fee that is suggested by your sales agent, which could be anywhere from 10, 12 to 25, 35%, depending on what the project is and if you are receiving a minimum guarantee from a sales agent, which by the way I will talk about in a minute, because there is some importance to that as well. So restricting your distribution expense means restricting the actual distribution expense, which is charged separately in addition to your sales agency fee in many cases. So you either want to make sure it's a very low amount in a percentage. Ideally, you want to discuss a capped distribution expense for the entire period of the term. So that, for example, you would say to an agent, why don't we do 15% sales agency fee and we cap all expenses for the entire term under the contract at like 50,000 or 80,000, depending on what kind of budget you have. If it's a small budgeted movie, the distribution expense should be really, really low, let's say 5 to 10. If it's a higher budgeted movie or medium budgeted movie, it could be 25 to 50. If it's a larger budgeted movie, anything over, let's say 10, 15 million, you would charge somewhere between 50 and 80 as a cap. Obviously, all of this is based on negotiation, so I'm not going to tell you this is what you have to do. I'm just giving you examples of ranges that could be applicable. I'd like to talk quickly about the minimum guarantee from a sales agent. A minimum guarantee from a sales agent is not the same as a minimum guarantee from a distributor. They're just called the same, but they're not the same. A distributor minimum guarantee is a buyer who buys the right to release the film or television project in a certain territory, a territory he represents. Meaning, a German buyer or distributor would buy the right for Germany to license the film or TV project in Germany and would give you a minimum guarantee distribution license fee, which is called a minimum guarantee because if the film or TV project does better in the territory, let's say in this case Germany, then the minimum guarantee that he has paid, you will participate later on in form of overages, which is your kind of profit participation of the revenues that are achieved in that country. So we call them overages, right? Now, if the sales agent gives you a minimum guarantee, he's advancing you money in the hopes that he can recoup from the various sales that he's making to the distributors and buyers. So a sales agent minimum guarantee is against all the territories that have not been sold yet. So it's an advance against unsold territories. So as he's selling to the Germany buyer, to the UK buyer, to the French buyer, as he's selling to those buyers, he will deduct this from his minimum guarantee that he gave you, that he advanced to you. That is in essence the same collateral than the bank would use, because the bank loan, the senior gap loan, also is against unsold territories. And because the minimum guarantee as well as the senior gap loan are recouping against the same collateral, you have to choose one option. You cannot have both. You either go with the minimum guarantee that's given to you by the sales agent against future sales that he makes, or you get a bank loan against future sales that the sales agent makes and then pays the bank back. So either or, you're going to have to choose one of those two options. So minimum guarantee from a sales agent is not the same as a minimum guarantee from a buyer that's buying for a certain territory. I just wanted to throw that out there because it's a very important distinction to be made as it relates to senior debt. If we talk about optimizing profits by optimizing the waterfall, we are looking at a recoupment structure. And the waterfall is basically nothing than a rank by rank repayment of what needs to be repaid. The bank loan, the mezzanine loan, the equity loan, anyone who is in this recoupment structure, anyone you have to pay back is going to be in this waterfall. And that really means that the waterfall pays out per the agreements that you have entered into and that you have executed. So when you do a deal with the bank will recoup first in line from that waterfall. And then you do a deal with the mezzanine lender, he recoups next, and so forth. And the equity, he recoups next. And then comes all the back-end participation. Every funding source has a place where it recoups. That means unless you have an investor who shares in the back end or a profit participant who shares in the back end, they all recoup one after the other. They don't share in the collateral and they don't share in the recoupment. So it's very important to look at your agreements and make sure they all fit their little slot in the waterfall. Because if they don't fit, you will not be able to close your deal. So as you learn about waterfall ranking, keep in mind that every financing deal you make has to fill a slot in that waterfall ranking system. Establish market-driven projects that can achieve profits for producers and investors. What that really means is you look at the marketplace that are placing your project into. If it's a TV project, what network can you sell it to? What streaming service can you sell it to? Do your research and figure out where it can go. And if it's a film project, you figure out, is it a small budgeted movie that can go through the festivals? Is it a medium or higher budgeted movie that can be sold globally through sales agents? Or can I do a mix where I sell a portion already to a domestic buyer and then my weight on the foreign can be a little lower. It doesn't have to be a 75% level, could be less because I sold already to domestic and maybe I got 30, 40, 50% for my domestic rights. So anything you do, any project you do really has its own kind of market and has its own validity in that market. As long as you stay with and focus on the market that you're aiming towards, you're going to be okay in relation to the profits that you can expect. We obviously already talked about free money and the importance of having free money, meaning non-recoupable funding sources in your finance plan as they increase profits. But let's look at some of these funding sources and see, how we can learn more about them. U.S. production incentives are basically incentives that are provided as tax credits or tax rebates by United States, by U.S. states, meaning New Mexico, Georgia, etc. Entertainment Partners actually has a very cool website where you can see on their incentives calendar, so to speak, what state is available and offering what incentive. And they obviously vary. Some do below the line, some only do above the line, some do a portion of below the line, not all of it. Some do a portion of the above the line, not all of it. So the eligibility of your spend is something you need to look into very detailed, and it's a state-by-state requirement, and it changes depending on where you are shooting. So check out this website and check out the details on the local states' websites. And see, what would be eligible in the certain state that you would be shooting in. And just also kind of keep an eye on changes, because Iowa at some point offered a 50% tax credit, and it was gone a week later. So these things change all the time, and states will change their applicable tax credits and rebates. They will also change their applicable eligibility, and what you can finance and what you can't. So international co-productions and incentives are the next kind of element that we're looking at for the potential grants that could be applicable here. So if you do an international production, which means you would shoot outside of the United States, let's say for example you shoot in Europe, you shoot in the UK, or you shoot in Germany or Belgium or France, they offer local incentives as well, which are driven by points, and the points are reflected through your creative and production team. So that means when you shoot there, you want to hire as many locals as possible. You want to hire as many European passport holders as possible. So you really want to spend the money locally, and in that case you will be able to have more eligible expenses. There are situations, for example, like Germany, where American cast, when in Germany, would be subject to a rebate or a tax credit. So that means if you, for example, have Liam Neeson in your movie and he gets $5 million, you take him to Germany, Germany offers a 20% grant or a 20% tax credit, his $5 million would be subject to the 20%. You could get $1 million out of Germany just by having Liam Neeson spend time there on set in Germany. So there are ways for non-passport holders, for non-EU passport holders, to be eligible in European countries. Again, it varies country by country, and you need to go to the local websites and see what costs are eligible. And again, it changes all the time too, so it really makes sense to check this out and kind of stay in tune with what's happening over there. Branding and product placement. Product placement is one thing, branding is another thing. Product placement is basically when you take a bottle of Coke, you put it in the screen, and there you go, it's just shown as that. Branding and integration means that they might have a conversation about how great the Coke tastes, or it's somehow connected to the character, and the message that is related here with the character in this movie is aligned with the message of the brand. We'll go into this a little deeper when we go into brand integration, but this is kind of the gist of it. Brand integration is not recoupable because you already integrated the brand, you serviced what they're paying for. So that's why you will not have to recoup it. Crowdfunding, crowdsourcing, we talked about, does not have to be recouped because they are either in exchange for a service that's provided, and then the service is going to be paid for as a deferment and or a profit participation. Crowdfunding, same thing, it's not going to be recouped and is subject to a back-end profit participation as well. There are collateral corridor driven investments. For example, the music investment. We talked about music investments being the investment that will cover your music budget, which includes music supervisor, any music licenses, any scoring, etc. And it would be recouped by a corridor that's in this case identified as your music publishing rights. Music publishing obviously generates revenues through ASCAP, BMI, and other local similar entities, and this is usually paid to the producer if he owns the publishing rights, or even if he owns a portion of the publishing rights. In this case, this kind of revenue would go to the music investor who is paid for this music. In-kind services, we talked about this. Post-production services usually do not have to be paid back because it's an in-kind service unless it's and then it's paid back as a deferment, and it's usually also driven by profit participations. I'd like to talk a little bit about co-production and incentives. What is a US co-production? It's actually nothing else than, in most cases I should say, because there's always exclusions to rules, especially in Hollywood, but in most cases a US co-production would be a split rights deal. Splitting rights meaning someone holds the United States can also mean US and Canada, and another one holds foreign, meaning the rest of the world. So someone would be, for example, a US network. Like say you do a TV series with USA, or you have a documentary series that you sell to FX or to HBO, or you have a movie that you sell to Lifetime. And you would say to Lifetime, I will let you keep the US rights in perpetuity, meaning forever, and you will therefore pay me, let's say, half of my budget or 35% of my budget, something in that range. Usually split rights deals for US mean that the US buyer, if they only hold the US rights, meaning sometimes again US and Canada, would pay anywhere from 35 to 65% of your budget. Totally depends on your project, totally depends on the buyer. Again, this is just a range. This is not necessarily what's going to happen. It's just a range that I have seen for US co-productions. And then the foreign rights, as we have established, you know, they can be worth 75% of your budget. Ideally, sometimes it's less, sometimes it's more. Again, it depends on your project. But the other side of the financing component would then be able to hold the foreign rights and finance the production based on that set of rights. So as US co-production is basically a component where you split up the US and foreign. International co-productions, that's a little different. You can still be a US producer and do an international co-production. And in that case, you would do a co-production agreement with a local producer that would be tapping into the local treaty grants, meaning they would be the ones that would provide you with the local incentives that are foreign incentives and grants. They could be anywhere from 15 to 50% depending on the country, depending on what kind of treaty is entered into, and it's also depending on how many points, meaning European cast and team members and expenses are applicable. You have to always spend the money that you get in an international co-production locally, meaning in the country that you're in. You can't do an international co-production and say, okay, I'm getting this money from Germany, but I'm going to shoot this in the US. So any production incentive is usually driven by the region that you're shooting in, and the same applies for international co-production. And as I mentioned earlier, in some cases above the line is applicable, some cases they do not apply. So again, local rules and laws will tell you what subsidy and what credit is applicable. You have countries, for example, like, again, I'm going to use Germany because it's a good example, where you get an automatic tax credit of 20%. If you deduct some fees, it's usually coming down to like 17, 18. It's automatically applicable on every dollar you spend there. But in addition to that, there is a grant that is driven by a jury decision that you can also get on top of your tax credit. And this grant will look at things like, what's the story, who's the cast, how much money are they spending in this region, and do we like the project? So the jury locally will decide whether or not they add another $1 million, 2 or 3 to your project, and this will add to your tax credit. So let's say you have a $10 million movie, you shoot it in Germany, you get 20% tax credits, $2 million. In addition, the local grants that you can attach that are jury driven could be another $1 million or $2 million. So now you add another 2 million to the 2 million, and now you doubled your local subsidy, your local incentive, your local grant, and you get to $4 million. In addition, what happens in this situation is that you also have to sell to the local buyer, to a local distributor, and that local distributor will buy the license of this product as well, and they have to in order for you to get this additional grant. You do not need to get a local license to get the tax credit, but you do need a local license to get the grant, the jury-driven amount. So here you add another, I don't know, for a $10 million movie, maybe $1 million for this local sales. So you're now ending up getting $5 million for your $10 million movie if you shoot it in Germany. Just an example, just to, you know, put it out there, how it would work. In some cases, and very often is that the case in Europe, the local distributor is going to pay more if it's a European originated story. So if it's produced by a European producer, which could be your partner if you're American, and it's a story written by a European, at least 51%, then it would be a European origin project. And if that's the case, the local buyer distributor would pay more in the license fees. It could go up another 20-30%, which sometimes makes a lot of sense. We did talk about the US incentives, which can be anywhere from 15 to 40% depending on where you're shooting. You are going to see that there are rebates and credits available, and they change from state to state. Again, you have to shoot and expense the production locally in order to have this rebate or credit apply. And some states will allow above the line as an eligible expense, other states won't. For example, when we look at Puerto Rico, what they do, which is kind of interesting, they give you 40% of everything you spend there. They give you an additional 20% on your above the line. So they're not going to put the 40% on the above the line, but they're also not going to give you zero. So they say, we give you 40% on what you spend here, and we'll give you 20% on your above the line cost. So that's kind of a nice mix of how they do it. And there's different states that apply similar rules. Again, go to Entertainment Partners website where you find a lot of these details applied.
On the one hand, it's important that we put together a project that has a feasible budget, has a very strong finance plan, meaning the budget matches the marketability, has some pre-sales that signal market demand, and then we turn it over to put it on paper and put it all together in a finance plan. Now, at the time we put that finance plan together, we don't necessarily have to have everything in place. Usually the way it is, you have a script, you like the script, you think about an actor, you think about a director, you're assuming that you're going to get your sales estimate number, you're assuming that you get some kind of domestic, you're assuming that you get some pre-sales. You put that on paper the way you're learning it in this course, and then you start running your numbers. You put together a presentation that reflects the mood of your project. Let's say it's an elevated horror movie. The visuals need to go in line, and the coloring with the mood that you want to create with the picture. If it's a comedy, you use lighter colors, you use friendlier visuals. So your job is to make this business plan visually enticing, not just obviously factually enticing, but also visually enticing, because you are selling someone on the visual medium. So the style that you come up with, the colors you choose, the visuals you choose are actually pretty important. So when you put together your little business plan, there are a few things you need to kind of think about, and they relate or translate to the investor-producer checklist, as I call it. Excuse me. So it's not just the investor that does due diligence on you as a producer or on the producer and does due diligence on the project, but it's also the job of the producer to do due diligence on the investor. I cannot tell you how many times someone comes up to me and says, I have money for your movie, and they're full of shit, excuse my French. So I'm sorry, I'm being very direct here, but it happens more than you think. I mean, obviously it also happens that producers run around and say, I have money with my movie and we want to invest and all that stuff. So there's bullshit on both sides. Let's be honest about that. But it is important that you, if you are the producer, do a little due diligence with your investor, asking for proof of funds, asking him if he or she has done investments in the media space before, asking them what kind of risk appetite they have. Are they investors who would prefer to do lending rather than equity? Meaning, do they want to give you a loan and charge an interest every year, or do they want to give you an equity and have ownership with you and are more involved on the long term? These are the conversations you have to have with your investor. You have to honestly also ask, how much can you invest? What can you afford? Where is the money coming from? Do you have money? I mean, these are things you have to think about early on. When you talk to investors, you need to know what the risks are, and then you need to fully disclose them. you need to say to the investor clearly, dude, you could lose all your money, because that's the case. There is no scenario where you can stand in front of someone and say you will not lose your money, because that scenario doesn't exist in Hollywood. They invest in a highly risky environment, but because it is highly risky, our job as producers and also financiers is to make sure that we eliminate those various risk options. And there are ways, and we'll learn about this. So you're disclosing the risk and saying, here are the risks. A, the risk could be that the movie shows 75% estimates, but it only makes 50% in the end. So not all 75% are being sold. B, this kind of risk I'm offsetting by shooting the movie in a tax credit region that gets me not just the regular 25%, but maybe 35% somehow. And I can also offset it by maybe doing a US deal of some sort. So you offer various things to an investor that if a scenario occurs, you have a solution, or you've at least thought about a solution. So that's how you deal with risks. Now, obviously, when you are an emerging professional, it would help to put someone in that business plan that has some track record. Could be another producer who is enticed by your project, likes the idea, thinks it's unique and it's interesting. Could also be a track record heavy or at least established director. Do yourself a favor, if you are an emerging professional, do not work with first-time directors. I know that a lot of people think that's a great idea, because that first-time director might be a student colleague, might be someone you know, might be a friend. It is the blind leading the blind, and I always say try to avoid it. Obviously, in your business plan, you're projecting the value in the market, not just by using estimates, but also by talking about some of the comparable pictures. Now, comparable pictures I would always be very careful with, because if you go make a comedy and you compare yourself to My Big Fat Greek Wedding, the highest grossing independent comedy ever made in the history of movie making, that's a little out there. So don't pick the Blair Witch, for your horror movie, or pick the obvious like winners. Pick something that's in a similar budget range, has similar level of cast, and has somewhat level of success that you feel is realistic with your project, and just maybe 2 or 3. And it's really more about creating a sensibility of what you want to do with your film that makes the investor or entity that greenlights you understand what you're going for. You are aligning your interest with the interest of the investor by explaining to the investor, I'm going to use a collection agent. We have totally transparent accounting. All the recoupments is going to be seen on reports, and you get a copy of the report every month. That kind of transparency is very enticing to investors, and I think you should stress that. When you talk about investor deals, when we go into the agreements chapter of our course, we'll get more detailed into it. But just so you know what an industry standard investor deal is. If we're talking about an equity investor, the industry standard would be that guy would probably invest somewhere around 30 to 35% ideally, unless he takes over the senior loan position, in which case it could be anywhere around half the budget. And that is okay. If you have no loan, you can invest half the budget. Now, the more he invests, the more ownership he has. So if someone invests 50% of the budget, the ownership that they have in your movie is 25%. If they invest 30% of your budget, the ownership is 15%. Those are kind of the standards. That doesn't mean that the equity investor can't come to you and say, you know what, I know what the standards are, but I want more anyway. This happens. You have to deal with it when it comes, and maybe it's worth it. Now, equity investment usually charges a premium of 20%. I have not seen more in my practice. Sometimes I've seen a little less, but usually it's 20% of the money. So if someone gives you $1 million equity, you're going to pay back $1.2 million. That's how that works. What you want to do is you establish milestones and essential elements in writing. So milestones means the investor is going to ask you, how much money are you going to get by when? And your job is to give yourself enough time, but not too much time so that the investor runs and says, this is going to take forever, I'm never going to see my money back. So if you can stay in the 3-year time frame of some sorts, 2 to 3 years, that would be great. And then within those 3 years, just tell them, here's how much money I think I can make by that time. That's also a conversation you're going to have with the sales agent, because they need to support this kind of recoupment schedule that you have in mind, because they're actually the ones getting the money for you by selling distribution rights. You're going to talk to the investor about essential elements. Essential elements is the script and the cast and the director. So anything that creates value is essential. And if you change that, you need to get the investor to approve. That's usually how it works. I usually use arbitration clauses in my deals because I hate, huge legal fees, but that's up to you. I suggest it here. Not everyone has to do that. If the investor takes an active role, which they usually do not, but some want to, you need to specify that that role is a role that does not involve a decision-making component, because if the investor makes decisions, you're in trouble. So have him acknowledge that you run the ship because you're the producer. He is an investor. He does not have to do anything with the industry. So just make that clear, that he can have an active role, he can have meaningful consultation, but he should not be making decisions. You're going to tell your investor that there's no production risk and no risk of budget overages or abandonment, because you're going to use a completion bond company, which ensures exactly those things. The on-time and on-budget production of a film. Investors like that, because what can happen if you don't have a bond company is that you go over budget, someone has to pay for it, and usually it's the investor, because they don't want to lose the money they already gave you. It's not a good position for them to be in. And then when you do your budget, make sure that you spend the budget the way you have line itemed it. So, if your camera department has whatever, $200,000 in it, don't spend $300,000, spend $200,000. If you need to spend $300,000, have a conversation with the bond company about, in this case, it would be the bond company because they insure all this stuff, about how you want to shuffle things around. So in this example, you have 250, let's say, in camera, and you need 350. Now the 100 has to come from somewhere, and the bond company and you need to decide together where that money is coming from. It needs to come from another department or from contingency. Those are the kind of things you usually talk to the bond company about, but it could be that the investor wants to be involved in these conversations as well. We talked about transparent accounting. You let the investor know that you're using a collection agent that manages all the revenues. You will never get a dollar in your hand. They will appreciate that a third party touches the revenues and no one else. A third party that has no agenda. They will appreciate also that that third party is going to pay everyone back and pay the profits and costs the way it's supposed to be, so that there's no creative accounting applicable. The most important thing is that this actually happened to me, that you protect your master elements. Now nowadays everything is digitally, so it's a little easier. In the time of film, if the film roll was somewhere in a lab where you don't have a lab access letter, you're screwed. So, the master elements are yours. You need to protect them. You're going to obviously give a set to the sales agent so he can deliver to the various countries that he's selling to. But you also have to have a main master set that you have access to at any time. So sorry for this very long slide commentary here, but I wanted to go into this a little deeper so you understand the context, hopefully a little better. If you have questions, you know where to find me. Email me on Canvas.